The first thing I noticed was that the entire office had gone quiet. Not normal quiet. The kind of silence where you can actually hear the air conditioning running overhead. I was standing beside my desk, halfway through a conversation with one of my coworkers, when the elevator doors opened. Two men stepped out. Dark suits. Federal badges. Neither of them looked like they were there for a casual visit. One walked straight toward the receptionist. He showed her his credentials and said something I couldn't hear. She nodded nervously. Then he looked across the office. His eyes moved slowly from desk to desk, until they stopped on me. He pointed. "We're looking for Daniel. Is he here?" The receptionist didn't answer. She just looked at me. Then everyone else did too. It happened almost simultaneously. Heads turned. Chairs stopped moving. Someone near the conference room lowered their phone. My coworker beside me went completely silent. I looked behind me, almost expecting there to be another Daniel standing somewhere. There wasn't. I pointed at myself. "Me?" The agent nodded. "Daniel?" "Yeah." He started walking toward me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Can I ask what this is about?" "We need to speak with you." "About what?" The agent didn't answer. And that was the moment my confusion turned into genuine fear. Because I hadn't done anything. At least, I didn't think I had. I looked toward my boss's office. Mark was standing behind the glass wall. He was staring at the agents. Then he looked at me. For once, the man who always seemed to know exactly what was happening looked like he had absolutely no idea what was going on. I remember thinking, why would the FBI be looking for me? And even worse, what could possibly have happened in the last 3 weeks? Because 3 weeks earlier, the biggest problem in my life had been a fever. A 103-degree fever. And one text message to my boss. A text message I thought would simply cost me 1 day of work. I had no idea that morning would become the beginning of everything. It all started 3 weeks earlier. My name is Daniel, and at the time, I had been working for the same financial services company for almost 4 years. It was a mid-sized company outside Chicago, not one of those enormous corporations where nobody knows anyone's name. We had a few hundred employees, several departments, a fairly traditional corporate structure, and an office that looked exactly like what you'd imagine when someone says the words corporate America. Glass conference rooms, gray carpet, rows of desks, bad coffee, fluorescent lights that somehow made 9 a.m. feel like 3 p.m. The company handled financial operations, reporting, compliance support, and other services for corporate clients. My department was responsible for making sure things actually happened when they were supposed to. Reports went out. Numbers matched. Systems worked. Deadlines were met. And when something went wrong, somebody had to fix it. My official title was Operations Analyst. But after a while, that title stopped describing what I actually did. I became the person people called when something was broken. If a report failed at 8 p.m., somebody emailed me. If a senior executive needed something fixed before a morning meeting, somebody called me. If another employee couldn't figure out why a process wasn't working, they'd eventually walk over to my desk and say, "Hey, Daniel, do you have a second?" I almost always said yes. That was partly because I liked helping people. But if I'm being completely honest, there was another reason. I wanted to be good at my job. Really good. I'd always believed that if you worked hard enough, people eventually noticed. And my boss definitely noticed. His name was Mark Anderson. Mark was one of those managers who didn't have to raise his voice to intimidate people. Actually, he almost never yelled. That was what made him worse. He could walk into a room, set his coffee down, sit in a chair, and say nothing. And suddenly, everyone would start checking their work. People who had been joking 2 seconds earlier would straighten up. Someone would open a spreadsheet. Someone else would start explaining a deadline nobody had asked about. Mark just watched. He had this ability to make people feel like they were already in trouble before he had even said anything. I remember one of my coworkers warning me about him during my first few months. We were in the break room. She was making coffee. I was standing beside the counter. She looked toward the hallway before speaking. "You're going to want to remember something about Mark." I laughed. "What's that?" Don't ever tell him you're overwhelmed." I smiled. "Why?" She looked at me like I'd just asked the dumbest question imaginable. "Because if Mark finds out you're overwhelmed, he'll assume you have time for something else." I laughed again. She didn't. That was when I realized people weren't just annoyed by Mark. They were afraid of him. People would change vacation plans because they didn't want to deal with him afterward. They'd answer emails late at night. They'd come in early, on days they weren't scheduled to. They'd sit at their desks long after their work was finished, because they didn't want to be the first person to leave. Nobody wanted to be the employee Mark remembered for the wrong reason. I noticed all of it. But instead of taking the warning seriously, I convinced myself I could earn his respect. I thought if I became dependable enough, I wouldn't have to worry about him. And for a while, it seemed like I was right. My first major project with Mark came during an especially busy quarter. A report had gone wrong. The deadline was the next morning. Most of the team had already left. Mark stopped at my desk. "You know how to fix this?" I looked at the screen. "I think so." He frowned. "You think?" I turned toward him. "I can fix it." He nodded once. That's what I wanted to hear. Then he walked away. I stayed until almost midnight. I remember looking at the clock around 11:40 p.m. and realizing the entire floor was empty. I was sitting there, under those bright fluorescent lights, staring at a spreadsheet while the building's HVAC system hummed in the background. I finally finished. The next morning, Mark walked by my desk. He glanced at the report. "Good work." That's all he said. But I remember how I felt. I felt proud. Those 2 words meant something to me. I thought I'd earned them. And after that, things changed. Whenever something difficult came up, Mark started coming to me. "Daniel, can you take a look at this?" "Daniel, I need this before tomorrow." "Daniel, you're the only person who understands how this works." That last one became his favorite. "You're the only person I trust with this. You're the only one who understands the system. You're the only person I know will get it done." Every time he said it, I felt like I was being recognized. I didn't realize I was being trained to say yes, so I said yes, again, and again, and again. At first, staying late was occasional. Then it became normal. I'd look at the clock, and realize it was 8:30 p.m., then 9:15, then 10. Sometimes I'd be sitting at my desk at 11 p.m., listening to the cleaning crew moving through the hallway. I'd pack my laptop away, walk through the nearly empty office, and wonder why I was still there. But I'd also tell myself the same thing. This is temporary. Once this deadline passes, it'll slow down. It never did. Friday afternoons were especially bad. Everyone would start packing up. People would talk about dinner plans. Someone would mention a movie. Someone else would say they were going out of town. I'd shut my laptop. Then an email would appear. From Mark. Usually something simple. "Can you take a look at this?" Or, "Need this cleaned up before Monday." Sometimes, there wouldn't even be a message. Just an attachment. And somehow, I always knew what that meant. My weekend wasn't mine anymore. Saturday mornings became laptop mornings. Sunday afternoons became report afternoons. I'd sit at home with coffee beside me and work while my wife went about her day. She tried not to complain. That almost made it worse. There were nights when she'd sit across from me at the kitchen table while I answered emails. Finally she'd ask, "Are you almost done?" I'd look at the screen. "Almost." She'd wait. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Then she'd ask, "How long is almost?" I'd laugh. "I don't know." She'd smile, but it wasn't really a smile. That's what I thought. Then she'd leave me alone. I knew I was missing things. Dinner, weekends, friends, family. But I kept believing it was worth it. Because Mark kept telling me I was important. And I wanted to believe him. Then came the honeymoon. My wife and I had been planning it for months. Nothing extravagant. We weren't taking some enormous luxury vacation. We had just planned a few days somewhere warm. A chance to get away. No work, no emails, no spreadsheets, no conference calls. Just us. We had talked about it constantly. She had been excited for months. I was too. Until Mark called me into his office about 2 weeks before we were supposed to leave. He closed the door. That alone told me this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. Sit down. I did. He looked at his computer, then at me. We've got an issue. I waited. A reporting process had fallen behind. A deadline was coming up. And, according to Mark, there wasn't anybody else who could handle it. You'll need to stay on this. I stared at him. My honeymoon is next week. I know. I waited for him to say something else. He didn't. So what are you asking? He leaned back. I wouldn't ask if I had another option. There it was. That sentence again. The same sentence he'd used every time he wanted something from me. I wouldn't ask if I had another option. I remember sitting there thinking about everything I'd already done. Every late night. Every weekend. Every time I'd answered the phone. Every time I'd told my wife I'd be home soon. And somehow, I still said yes. I went home that night. My wife was sitting at the kitchen table. She looked up. What's wrong? I sat across from her. I might have to change our honeymoon. She stared at me. For what? Work. There was a long silence. Then she asked, Again? That one word hit harder than yelling would have. I looked down. I don't really have a choice. She didn't answer. A few seconds passed. Then she said, Daniel, you always have a choice. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't, because somewhere inside me, I knew she was right. Still, I chose work. I canceled the honeymoon. I stayed. I worked late. I worked through the weekend. And I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Mark would remember. I told myself the company would remember. I told myself that 4 years of loyalty had to count for something. That was the relationship I'd developed with my job. It wasn't just employment anymore. It was part of my identity. I was the dependable guy. The guy who never called out. The guy who answered. The guy who stayed. The guy who didn't make excuses. And Mark knew it. That's why, when I woke up 3 weeks before those federal agents walked into my office, my first thought wasn't about my health. It was about work. I woke up before my alarm. My head was pounding. My throat felt dry. My entire body felt heavy. For a few seconds, I just stared at the ceiling. Then I tried to sit up. The room shifted. I grabbed the mattress. Whoa! Even my own voice sounded strange. I reached for my phone. 5:47 a.m. My alarm wasn't going off for almost another hour. Normally, I would have gotten up. I had worked through headaches before. I'd worked while exhausted. I'd gone into the office when I felt awful. I had built an entire reputation around never being the person who said, I can't. But this time, I knew something was wrong. I got out of bed and walked into the bathroom. The light hurt my eyes. I opened the medicine cabinet and found the thermometer. I waited. Then it beeped. I looked down. 103 degrees Fahrenheit. I stared at the number. Then, I checked it again. Same result. I stood there for a few seconds, and the thought that came into my head made me feel strangely ashamed. Not I need to rest. Not I should call a doctor. Not even I'm really sick. My first thought was, Mark is going to be pissed. That realization bothered me. After 4 years of working for that man, I was more afraid of disappointing him than I was concerned about being sick. I went back to the bedroom. My hands were slightly shaky as I picked up my phone. I opened my messages, found Mark's name, and stared at it. I had never called out sick because I didn't want to be seen as unreliable. But there was no way I was driving to the office with a 103-degree fever. So I typed the simplest message I could. I told him I had a 103-degree fever and couldn't come in. I read it twice. Then I hit send. For several seconds, nothing happened. I put my phone down. Then it buzzed. I picked it up. One message. From Mark. No greeting. No. Are you okay? No. Get some rest. No concern at all. Just one sentence. I read it. Then read it again. If you're healthy enough to text, you're healthy enough to work. I stopped breathing for a second. I stared at the screen. And somewhere beneath the fever, beneath the exhaustion, beneath 4 years of loyalty, something inside me finally cracked. Because for the first time, I understood that all those years I'd spent proving how dependable I was, hadn't made Mark respect me. They had simply taught him that I would keep showing up no matter what. And that realization scared me far more than the 103-degree fever ever could. I put my phone face down on the mattress. For a few seconds, I just stared at the ceiling. I could hear the heater running. A car passed outside. Somewhere in the apartment, the refrigerator kicked on. Everything was completely normal. Except, nothing felt normal anymore. I kept looking at the ceiling, and thinking about that message. If you're healthy enough to text, you're healthy enough to work. 4 years. 4 years of weekends. 4 years of late nights. 4 years of answering emails when everyone else was asleep. 4 years of taking calls during dinner. 4 years of choosing work when I should have been choosing my wife. 4 years of telling myself that Mark trusted me. And when I finally needed one day, that was what I got. Not concern. Not even basic professionalism. Just a sentence that made me feel like I'd somehow done something wrong by getting sick. I picked up my phone again. The message was still there. I thought about responding. Part of me wanted to write something angry. I'm not coming in. Another part wanted to explain myself. I'm literally running a 103-degree fever. Another part of me wanted to apologize. That was the worst part. I actually felt guilty. Guilty for being sick. I stared at the keyboard for almost a minute. Then I locked my phone. I wasn't going to argue with him. Not that morning. I put the phone on the nightstand and lay back down. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't thinking about what needed to be finished at work. I was thinking about what I'd allowed work to become. And once I started thinking about it, I couldn't stop. I remembered every weekend I'd sacrificed. Every time my wife had eaten dinner alone because I was still answering emails. Every time I'd said, just give me another hour. Every time I'd promised that things would be different after the next deadline. And then I remembered the honeymoon. That one hurt the most. I had canceled something important because I believed my sacrifice would mean something. Now I was lying in bed with a fever, and the same man couldn't even give me the benefit of the doubt. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. Eventually, I did. It was another message from Mark. Need the client file updated by noon. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I didn't know what else to do. I had just told him I had a 103-degree fever. His response was to give me a deadline. I typed, I won't be able to work today. I stared at the sentence. Then I deleted it. I typed it again. Deleted it again. Finally, I sent nothing. I put the phone down. That was the first small boundary I'd ever set with Mark. I didn't know it at the time, but it wouldn't be the last. I spent most of the morning asleep. When I woke up, my wife was sitting beside the bed. She had a glass of water in her hand. How are you feeling? Terrible. She put the glass down. Did you hear from work? I hesitated. Yeah. She immediately knew. What did he say? I looked at her. He said if I'm healthy enough to text, I'm healthy enough to work. Her expression changed. For a second, she didn't say anything. Then she asked quietly, he actually said that? I nodded. She looked down. Then she looked back at me. Daniel, that's not normal. I know. No, I mean, really, not normal. I swallowed. I know. She sat there for a moment. Then she said something that stayed with me. You've spent 4 years trying to prove you're valuable to people who already decided they could use you. I didn't respond, because I didn't have an argument. She was right. And hearing it from her made something inside me hurt in a way the fever couldn't explain. I slept again. By late afternoon, my fever had started coming down. I still felt awful, but I could think more clearly, and the clearer my head became, the more uncomfortable I felt about everything. I opened my laptop, not to work, just to look. My inbox was full. Messages from coworkers. A couple of automated notifications. Several emails from Mark. I opened one. Need status. Another. Any update? Another. Call me. I closed the laptop. I didn't call. That was unusual. Very unusual. Mark wasn't accustomed to me ignoring him. For 4 years, I'd been available. If he called, I answered. If he emailed, I responded. If he sent a message, I reacted. Even when I was on vacation. Even when I was with my wife. Even when I was exhausted. And now, I was simply not responding. That silence seemed to bother him. Around 6 that evening, my phone rang. Mark. I watched it vibrate on the nightstand. My wife looked at me. You don't have to answer. I know. Phone kept ringing. I didn't answer. Eventually, it stopped. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Call me when you see this. I stared at it. Then I turned the phone over. The next morning, I woke up feeling better. Not good, but better. My fever was down. I could stand without feeling like the room was moving. I knew I could physically go to work. And that's when the decision became difficult. Because I had spent 4 years training myself to believe that being sick was not a valid reason to stop. I showered, got dressed, then stood in front of the closet. My work clothes were hanging there. For a few seconds, I considered putting them on. Then I remembered the message. If you're healthy enough to text, you're healthy enough to work. Something about it still bothered me. So I stayed home. I sent a short message saying I needed another day to recover. This time, Mark didn't answer immediately. Hours passed. Nothing. And somehow, that silence felt more threatening than the messages. By the following morning, I was back at work. The second I walked through the doors, I could tell something had changed. People looked at me. Not casually, not the normal way coworkers look at each other. They were watching me. I walked toward my desk. One of my coworkers leaned over. You okay? Yeah. She looked around. You sure? Yeah. Why? She hesitated. Mark's been in a mood. I almost smiled. He's always in a mood. She didn't smile back. No, I mean, worse than usual. I sat down. My computer was already on. There were dozens of messages. I opened the first one. Then, the second. Then, the third. Nothing unusual. Until I opened an email from Mark. Come to my office. No explanation. No context. Just that. I stood up. The walk to his office felt longer than usual. I knocked. Come in. Mark was sitting behind his desk. He didn't look up. I stood there. Close the door. I did. He finally looked at me. You understand the position you put us in? I stared at him. I was sick. You were unavailable. I told you I had a 103-degree fever. He leaned back. People depend on you. I almost laughed. I was sick, Mark. He stared at me. Then he said, we don't need to have this conversation if you're going to get defensive. I'm not being defensive. You're arguing. No. I'm explaining. He tapped his fingers against the desk. Then he said, your attitude lately has changed. I didn't know what he meant. My attitude? Yes. I've been working here for 4 years. I know. And I've never had a problem with you before. His expression barely changed. That's not what we're discussing. I looked at him. And for the first time, I realized something. He wasn't interested in what happened. He wasn't interested in whether I was actually sick. He wanted me to accept that I had violated an expectation. An expectation that had never been written down. The expectation that I was always available. I nodded slowly. Okay. He looked at me. Okay? Yes. Then I walked out. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Because after that meeting, things at the office started feeling different. Not dramatically. Not overnight. It was subtle. Mark stopped asking me for help directly. Instead, requests started coming through email. Everything became documented. Please confirm. Please provide. Please explain. The tone had changed. And I noticed something else. Other people noticed too. One afternoon, a coworker stopped beside my desk. Did something happen? I looked up. What do you mean? Between you and Mark. I shook my head. Nothing. She gave me a look. Daniel, I'm serious. She lowered her voice. He was asking about you. My stomach tightened. What did he ask? Whether you were still committed to the team. I stared at her. What did you say? Nothing. She looked uncomfortable. Then she walked away. That night, I went home and told my wife. She listened quietly. Then she asked, "Are you going to quit?" I looked at her. "I don't know." She nodded. "Do you want to?" I thought about it. 4 years ago, the answer would have been immediate. No. Now? I couldn't answer. Because quitting felt like admitting that everything I'd sacrificed had been for nothing. But staying felt like admitting that I was willing to keep being treated that way. So I stayed. At least for the moment. And I started paying closer attention. Not just to Mark. To everything. I noticed how often people stayed late. How often Mark's instructions changed. How frequently coworkers were told one thing verbally, and something completely different later. I noticed how nervous people became whenever he called them into his office. And I started noticing something else. People were keeping records. Emails, messages, files. Not because anyone had officially told them to. They just seemed to have developed the instinct. Save everything. I didn't know why. I didn't ask. I just started doing the same. If Mark sent me an instruction, I kept the email. If he changed something, I saved the earlier version. If a conversation happened in person, I wrote down what I remembered afterward. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. I wasn't plotting anything. I was simply beginning to protect myself. And the more I documented, the more uncomfortable I became. Because some of the things I was finding didn't make sense. There were inconsistencies in project records. There were instructions that didn't match earlier communications. There were files that had been changed after the fact. At first, I assumed it was normal corporate chaos. Companies are messy. People make mistakes. Managers forget things. Documents get updated. Nothing about that automatically meant something was wrong. But then I found something that made me stop. I was reviewing an old set of records late one evening. The office was nearly empty. I clicked through the files. Then I saw a discrepancy. I went back, checked it again. The numbers were different. Not slightly different. Different enough that I knew I hadn't imagined it. I checked the timestamp. Then I checked the version history. My heart started beating faster. Someone had changed the file. I sat there staring at my screen. I didn't know who. I didn't know why. And I didn't know whether it had anything to do with Mark. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to touch it. Not until I understood what I was looking at. I closed the file. Then I shut down my computer. On the drive home, I kept thinking about it. By the time I got home, I'd convinced myself it was probably nothing. The next morning, I opened the same file. The discrepancy was gone. I stared at the screen. The numbers now matched the original report. For a moment, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I had opened the wrong version. Maybe I had misunderstood the data. Maybe exhaustion had gotten to me. Then I checked the version history. The change was still there. Someone had corrected it. But I hadn't. And I knew. Nobody had asked me to. I sat back in my chair. For the first time since I started working there, I felt something I'd never felt before. I felt watched. Not physically. Just aware. Aware that my work was being examined. Aware that other people's decisions might be connected to mine. Aware that I had spent 4 years inside a system I didn't fully understand. And then Mark walked past my desk. He stopped, looked at my screen, and asked casually, "Everything okay?" I closed the file. "Yeah." He stared at me for one extra second, then smiled. "Good," and walked away. I watched him disappear down the hallway. I didn't know what he knew. I didn't know what I knew. But I knew something had changed. And from that point forward, every time my computer chimed with a new email, I felt a small knot form in my stomach. Because I was beginning to understand that the sick day hadn't created the problem. It had only opened my eyes to it. And a few days later, I received an email from Mark that made me realize just how serious things were becoming. The subject line contained only 3 words. "We need to talk." I opened it. There was no explanation, just a meeting invitation. And when I looked at who else had been added to the meeting, my stomach dropped. Because for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about my sick day anymore. I sat there staring at the meeting invitation. Mark had scheduled it for 9 the next morning. The attendees list included me, Mark, and 2 people from management. That was enough to make my stomach tighten. I read the invitation again. Then again, there was no agenda, no explanation. Just, meeting, Daniel, performance discussion. I leaned back in my chair. Performance discussion. Those 2 words were corporate code for about 100 different things. Maybe it was disciplinary. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe Mark had decided the sick day was something he wanted documented. Or maybe it had something to do with the files I'd been looking at. That last possibility bothered me the most. I closed the invitation. For the next 20 minutes, I tried to work. I couldn't concentrate. Every few seconds, I found myself looking toward Mark's office. His glass wall gave me a partial view of his desk. He was talking to someone. I couldn't hear the conversation. Then he glanced toward me. Our eyes met. He looked away. That tiny moment made my stomach sink. I turned back toward my monitor. A few minutes later, the coworker who had previously warned me about Mark walked past. She slowed down. "You okay?" "Yeah." She looked at my screen. "What's that?" "Meeting with Mark tomorrow." Her expression changed. "Just you?" "No. 2 other people." She was quiet for a moment. "Did he say why?" "No." She looked toward Mark's office, then back at me. "Be careful." I gave her a tired smile. "That's encouraging." "I'm serious." "I know." She hesitated, then she lowered her voice. "Don't let him get you to agree to something you don't understand." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means, read everything before you sign anything." She walked away before I could ask another question. I watched her disappear around the corner. For the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't shake what she'd said. By 5:30, most people had started leaving. I stayed at my desk. Not because I had to. Because I didn't want to go home with the feeling that something was waiting for me in the morning. Around 6:15, Mark walked past. He stopped beside my desk. "You'll be here tomorrow morning?" I looked up. "I'll be here." "Good." He started walking away, then stopped. Without turning around, he said, "Bring your notes." I frowned. "What notes?" He finally looked at me. "Anything related to the files you've been reviewing." My chest tightened. "Okay." He nodded. Then he walked away. That was the confirmation I had been afraid of. He knew. Maybe, not everything, but he knew I'd been looking. I stayed another 30 minutes. I didn't open the files again. I just sat there thinking. When I finally got home, my wife could tell immediately that something was wrong. She was in the kitchen. She looked over as I walked in. "How bad?" I took off my jacket. "I have a meeting tomorrow." "With Mark?" "Yeah." "Just you?" "2 other people are attending." She stopped what she was doing. "What happened?" "I don't know, Daniel. I really don't." She studied my face. "Is this because of the sick day?" "I thought it was." "And now?" I sat down. "Now, I don't know." I told her about the files, about the discrepancies, about the meeting invitation, about Mark telling me to bring my notes. She listened, without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have copies of your work?" "I have the emails." "Keep them." "I will." "Don't delete anything." "I won't." She sat across from me. "Whatever happens tomorrow, don't let them make you feel like you're crazy." I looked at her. "Why would they?" She gave me a look. "Because that's what people do when they don't want you questioning something." I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about that meeting. At one point, I woke up and looked at the clock. 3:12 a.m. I checked my phone. No messages. I put it back down. Then, I remembered something. The file. I got out of bed, went to my laptop, and checked the version history again. There it was. The change. The timestamp. The original version. I took screenshots. Then I closed everything. I went back to bed. At 7:30 the next morning, I was in the office. The atmosphere felt different. Maybe it was because I was nervous. Maybe everyone was simply quieter than usual. But I couldn't shake the feeling that people were watching me. I walked past the reception area. The receptionist smiled. "Morning." "Morning." She looked at me for half a second longer than normal. Then she asked, "Big meeting today?" I stopped. "How did you know?" She immediately looked uncomfortable. "Mark mentioned it." Of course he had. I smiled politely. "Yeah." Then I kept walking. At my desk, I found an email waiting. From Mark. Conference room at 9. No other words. I checked the time. 8:53. I gathered my notebook. My hands felt cold. I walked toward the conference room. The door was closed. Through the glass, I could see Mark sitting at the table. 2 other managers were already there. Neither of them looked at me. I opened the door. Mark looked up. "Close the door." I did. "Sit down." I sat. One of the managers opened a folder. Mark folded his hands on the table. "Daniel, this meeting is about several concerns we've had recently." I didn't say anything. He continued. "Your availability." I almost laughed. "My availability?" "Yes." "You mean the one day I was sick?" His expression hardened. "This isn't just about one day." There it was. The same sentence I'd been expecting. I looked at the other 2 managers. Neither reacted. Mark opened the folder. "You've also raised questions regarding certain operational records." My heart started pounding. "I asked questions because I found inconsistencies." "You weren't asked to investigate those inconsistencies." "I wasn't investigating." "Then what were you doing?" "Reviewing my work." Mark leaned forward. "Those files were not within your scope." I stared at him. "Some of them were?" "Some?" "Yes." He exchanged a glance with one of the managers. Then he said, "This is exactly the problem." "What problem?" "You're becoming difficult." I sat back. "Because I asked questions?" "Because you're questioning decisions that aren't yours to question." The room went quiet. I looked down at my notebook. Then back at him. "I've worked here for 4 years. I know. I've never had a disciplinary issue. I know. I've stayed late more times than I can count. I know. I've worked weekends. I know. I canceled my honeymoon because you needed me." One of the managers shifted in his chair. Mark's expression didn't change. "This isn't about your personal sacrifices." I felt something inside me go cold. "Then what is it about?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another document. "This." He slid a printed page across the table. I looked down. It was one of the reports I'd been reviewing. My name was on it. My stomach dropped. "What is this?" Mark said, "This report contains information that shouldn't have been accessed." I looked at him. "I was working on it." "You accessed files outside your assigned permissions." "No." Mark's eyebrows lifted. "No?" "I had access to those files." "That's not what I asked." I looked at the page again. Something wasn't right. The date didn't match. I checked it twice. "Mark, this isn't the version I worked on." He leaned back. "How do you know?" "Because I remember the file." "You're saying this document was altered?" "I don't know." "Then why are you making accusations?" "I'm not accusing anyone." He looked toward the other managers, then back at me. "You're becoming increasingly defensive." I felt my jaw tighten. "No, I'm trying to understand why a document I'm being shown isn't the same document I worked on." Nobody spoke. Mark closed the folder. "That's enough for today." I stared at him. "Are we done?" "For now." I stood. As I reached the door, Mark said, "Daniel." I turned. He looked directly at me. "Don't discuss this meeting with anyone." I nodded. Then I walked out. The hallway felt colder than it had 10 minutes earlier. I returned to my desk. Nobody asked what happened. Nobody needed to. They could see my face. I opened my computer. There was a new email. No subject. No message. Just an attachment. I recognized the file immediately. It was the same report from the meeting. I opened it. Then I compared it to the version I had saved. My heart started pounding. They were different. Not just the numbers, the timestamps, the metadata. The person listed as having made the change. I stared at the screen. My name was attached to the modified version. I felt my stomach turn. I hadn't made that change. I knew I hadn't. But according to the file, I had. I immediately saved everything. I didn't tell Mark. I didn't tell my coworkers. I didn't tell anyone at the office. That evening, I went home and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. My wife stood behind me. "What is it?" I turned the screen toward her. She looked at it. Then at me. "Is that your name?" "Yeah." "Did you do it?" "No." She was quiet. Then she asked, "Are you sure?" I looked at her. 100%. She pulled out a chair. "Then somebody is making it look like you did." I didn't answer, because saying it out loud made the situation feel much more serious. For 4 years, I had trusted that company. I had trusted the systems. I had trusted the people around me. And now I was looking at a document that appeared to show me doing something I knew I hadn't done. The next morning, I went into work early. I wanted to check the original records before anyone else arrived. The office was almost empty. I sat down, logged in, opened the file history, and then I noticed something I hadn't noticed the night before. There was another access record. A second user had opened the file after me. I stared at the username. I recognized it. It belonged to someone with authority over the system. My heart started beating faster. I checked the timestamp. Then I checked the date. Then, I checked the change history. The person had accessed the file after I had left for the night. I sat completely still. Someone had changed the document after I was gone. And somehow, the final version carried my name. I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing I could think of. I documented it. Screenshots, timestamps, emails, everything. I saved copies of every record I could legitimately access. Then I closed the files. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Mark was standing there. He looked at my screen. Then at me. "You're here early." "Couldn't sleep." He smiled faintly. "Still thinking about yesterday?" I didn't answer. He walked closer. "You should be careful, Daniel." My throat went dry. "Careful about what?" He looked at me for a moment, then said, "Sometimes asking too many questions creates problems you didn't have before." He walked away. I sat there staring after him. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about my job. I wasn't thinking about my reputation. I wasn't even thinking about whether I would get fired. I was thinking about the possibility that someone had deliberately attached my name to something I hadn't done. And if that was true, then the meeting yesterday hadn't been a warning. It had been preparation. Preparation for something bigger. I spent the next several days keeping my head down. I did my work. I answered normal emails. I stopped volunteering for extra assignments. I kept copies of anything important. And I tried not to give Mark a reason to accuse me of anything else. But the tension in the office kept getting worse. People noticed. Conversations stopped when I walked into rooms. Coworkers who used to joke with me suddenly became careful. One afternoon, someone messaged me privately. "Are you okay?" I replied, "Why?" The response came almost immediately. "Just be careful." I stared at the message. "About what?" No response. I waited. Nothing. I sent another message. Still nothing. That was when I realized people were scared to talk to me. Not because of me. Because of Mark. And whatever was happening behind the scenes. A few days later, I received another meeting invitation. This time, there was no subject line. Just a time. 10 a.m. I accepted. The next morning, I walked into the conference room. Mark was already there. But he wasn't alone. There was a folder on the table. Thicker than the last one. He looked at me. "Sit down." I did. He placed his hands on the folder. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Daniel, we're going to need you to explain exactly what you've been doing with these files." I looked at the folder. Then at him. And suddenly, I understood. This wasn't a performance meeting. It wasn't about my sick day. It wasn't even about my attitude. Someone had been building a case. And somehow, my name was sitting right in the middle of it. I looked at the folder again. It was sitting there between us, like a threat. "Explain what?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, system logs, reports, and several pages I'd never seen before. He slid the first page across the table. I picked it up. It was an access record. My username was at the top. I looked at the timestamp. Then I looked at Mark. I didn't do this. He leaned back. That's your username. I know. That's your account. I know. So help me understand. I stared at the document. There was a strange pressure building in my chest. Mark, I can't explain something I didn't do. He folded his arms. That's not a very helpful answer. I looked at the two managers sitting across from me. Neither one was looking directly at me. That bothered me. They weren't acting like people trying to figure out what happened. They were acting like people who had already decided something had happened. I turned back to Mark. What exactly are you accusing me of? I'm not accusing you of anything. I almost laughed. Then why am I sitting here? Because there are discrepancies. Between what? He pushed another document toward me. This. I read it. My stomach tightened. It showed a series of changes made to several internal records. My account was associated with the activity. I shook my head. I didn't make these changes. Then who did? I don't know. Mark's eyes narrowed. You expect me to believe someone else was using your account? I'm telling you, I didn't do it. That's not the same thing. I put the paper down. Can I see the full access logs? There was a pause. One of the managers finally spoke. We're reviewing those. Then, I'd like to see them. Mark looked at him, then back at me. You don't need to conduct your own investigation. I'm not. That's exactly what you're doing. No. I'm trying to understand why my name is attached to changes I didn't make. Mark leaned forward. Daniel, you need to understand something. This company takes data integrity very seriously. I stared at him. So do I. Then you should have thought about that before accessing files outside your normal workflow. I didn't access anything outside my workflow. That's not what the records indicate. I looked down at the papers. Something about this whole thing felt wrong. Not just unfair. Wrong. The timing. The documents. The way everything seemed to point toward me. And then I remembered something. Wait! Mark looked at me. I was working late the night those changes happened. So? I left around 9:30. He said nothing. I remember because I sent an email to my wife when I got in the car. One of the managers glanced at Mark. I continued. If the changes happened after that, I wasn't here. Mark's expression didn't move. Your account was active. Then someone used it after I left. That's speculation. So is saying I made the changes. The room went silent. For the first time, Mark looked irritated. Not angry. Irritated. Like I'd made the conversation more complicated than he wanted it to be. He closed the folder. Here's what we're going to do. I waited. Until this is resolved, you will not access those files. I nodded. Fine. You'll continue your normal responsibilities. Okay. And you will not discuss this matter with other employees. I looked at him. Why? Because it's confidential. I almost said something, then stopped. There was no point. I stood up. As I reached the door, one of the managers called my name. Daniel. I turned. He looked uncomfortable. Just cooperate. I nodded. I am. Then I left. The hallway felt strangely bright. People were moving around. Phones were ringing. Someone was laughing near the break room. Normal office life. Except I felt like I was walking through a place where everyone knew something I didn't. I returned to my desk. My coworker looked over. How'd it go? I shook my head. Not good. She lowered her voice. What happened? I can't talk about it. She stared at me. Okay. Then she looked around. Just, be careful. That phrase again. I looked at her. Why does everyone keep saying that? She hesitated. I don't know what you're talking about. You just said it. I meant be careful in general. Right. She looked away. I knew she was hiding something, but I also knew she was scared. So, I let it go. For the next several days, I did exactly what Mark told me to do. I didn't touch the restricted files. I didn't ask coworkers questions. I didn't talk about the meeting. I showed up. I worked. I went home. But the atmosphere around me kept changing. People stopped stopping by my desk. Conversations became shorter. And whenever Mark walked through the department, I noticed people watching him. One afternoon, I was getting coffee, when I overheard two employees talking quietly near the kitchen. "Did they ask you?" I told them I didn't know anything. "Good." Then they noticed me. The conversation stopped. One of them smiled awkwardly. "Hey, Daniel." "Hey." I poured my coffee. Neither of them spoke again. I walked back to my desk, wondering what exactly they had been asked. The next morning, I received an email from management. It requested that I confirm my recent activity on several systems. I read the list. Some of the systems were ones I used every day. Others, I barely recognized. I responded honestly. I explained what I had accessed, and what I hadn't. Then I sent the email. Within 15 minutes, Mark replied, "Let's discuss." I stared at those two words. Everything was becoming, "let's discuss." I went to his office. He motioned for me to sit. "You sent the response?" "Yes." "You said you don't recognize one of the systems." "That's correct. But your account accessed it." "Then someone used my account." He sighed. "Daniel, I'm telling you the truth. I understand you're uncomfortable." "I'm not uncomfortable. I'm confused." "There's a difference?" "Yes." He looked at me for several seconds. Then he said, "You've been with this company 4 years." "Yes." "You've had excellent performance reviews." "Yes." "We've trusted you with sensitive information." "I know. Which is why this is disappointing." That word hit me harder than I expected. Disappointing. After everything I'd done. After 4 years. He was talking to me like I'd betrayed him. I leaned forward. "Mark, if you think I did something wrong, just tell me." He stared at me. "I'm not saying that." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to be careful." I almost smiled. "You keep saying that." He didn't respond. I stood. "I'll keep cooperating." "Good." I left. But as I walked back to my desk, one thought wouldn't leave me alone. Why was Mark so interested in making sure I felt responsible before anyone had actually established what happened? That night, I went home and opened my personal notebook. I'd started keeping it a few weeks earlier. Nothing dramatic, just dates, times, conversations, things I remembered. I wrote down everything from the meeting. Then I wrote down Mark's exact words as best I could remember them. I didn't know whether I'd ever need the notes. I just knew I wanted a record. My wife watched me from the other side of the room. "What are you doing?" "Writing things down." "Why?" "Because I don't trust my memory anymore." She came closer. "What do you mean?" "I mean, every time something happens, they show me a document that says something different." She looked at the notebook. Then, at me. "Daniel, what?" "I think you need to talk to someone outside the company." I knew what she meant. I don't even know what I'd say. "Tell them what you just told me." I closed the notebook. "I don't want this to become bigger than it already is." She looked at me. "I think it already is." I didn't answer. The next morning, I arrived early again. There was an email waiting for me. It came from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was, "You need to look at this." I stared at it. For a few seconds, I wondered if I should open it. Then I did. There was one attachment, no explanation. I opened it. My heart stopped. It was a copy of an internal record. But it wasn't just any record. It showed a transaction I'd never seen before. The date was several months earlier. The account involved was one of the company's major clients. And next to the transaction was my username. I stared at it. I checked the date. Then, the timestamp. Then the system. I had never even been assigned to that client. I knew that because I remembered the account. It belonged to another team. I sat there completely still. Someone had used my credentials to access something I had no reason to access. And whoever had sent me the document wanted me to know. I looked around the office. Nobody was watching me. Or at least, nobody appeared to be. I closed the attachment. Then I opened it again. I wanted to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. I hadn't. I saved a copy. Then another. I didn't know who had sent it. I didn't know how they had gotten it. And I didn't know why they had chosen me. But I knew I couldn't ignore it. A few minutes later, Mark walked in. He stopped when he saw me. "Morning." "Morning." He looked at my monitor. "What are you working on?" I minimized the screen. "Nothing important." His eyes stayed on me for a second. Then he smiled. "Good." He walked away. My hands were shaking. Because suddenly, the question wasn't whether somebody had used my account. The question was why. And if someone had been using my credentials for months, how much had they done? I spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it. That became impossible around 4 p.m. I received another message. This one wasn't from Mark. It was from the same unknown sender. 3 words. "Check the dates." There was another attachment. I opened it. It was a timeline. Several months of activity, accesses, changes, approvals, and my username appeared again and again. My stomach dropped. But there was something else. The timestamps didn't line up with my schedule. Some of them were during evenings when I was at home. Some were weekends. One was on a day I had been out of town. I knew because I had the hotel receipt. I knew where I was. I knew I hadn't been in that office. Yet the system said my account had been active. I printed the timeline, then immediately regretted it. I looked around. The printer was in the open. I quickly grabbed the pages and folded them into my notebook. I didn't know who I could trust. That was the part that hurt. For 4 years, I'd thought of these people as coworkers. Some of them as friends. Now every conversation felt like something I needed to analyze. Every email felt like evidence. Every request from Mark felt like a trap. And then, just before I left that evening, Mark called me into his office again. I walked in. He closed the door. This time, there was no folder. No managers. Just him. He looked exhausted. Almost nervous. I'd never seen him like that. He motioned for me to sit. I did. He stared at the desk for a moment. Then he looked at me. "Daniel, I'm going to give you some advice." I waited. "Stop digging." My heart started pounding. Digging into what? He didn't answer. I held his gaze. "Mark, what are you talking about?" He leaned back. "You don't want to know everything that's going on here." I felt a chill run through me. "Then tell me why my name keeps appearing in records I didn't create." His expression changed, just slightly, but I saw it. He knew exactly what I was talking about. For the first time, I was certain of that. He lowered his voice. "Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let a problem solve itself." I stared at him. "And if it doesn't?" He didn't answer. I stood up. As I reached the door, he said, "Daniel." I turned. He looked directly at me. "If I were you, I'd start thinking very carefully about what I want to happen next." I walked out of his office. My hands were cold. I went straight to my desk, grabbed my things, and left. I didn't tell my coworkers what had happened. I didn't tell my wife yet. I just drove home. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook. I laid out every document I'd saved, every timestamp, every email, every inconsistency. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether Mark was trying to punish me for taking a sick day. That question was too small. Something much bigger was happening. Something that had apparently started long before I ever got sick. And somewhere inside that mess was my name. The next morning, I arrived at work expecting another confrontation. Instead, I found something waiting on my desk. A plain envelope. No name. No company logo. Nothing written on the outside. I looked around. Nobody seemed to be watching. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I read the first line. Then, I read it again. My hands started shaking. Because whoever had left that envelope had written one sentence that changed everything. "You are not the person they're investigating." I stared at those words. And for the first time since this nightmare had started, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I hadn't wanted to believe. Maybe someone wasn't trying to make me look guilty. Maybe someone was trying to make me look guilty because I had accidentally gotten too close to something they were desperate to hide. I looked toward Mark's office. His blinds were closed. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't see my boss as the man who controlled my career. I saw him as someone who might be afraid. And if Mark was afraid, I had to ask myself one terrifying question. What had I stumbled into? I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the envelope, about the sentence, "You are not the person they're investigating." If that was true, then why had my name appeared on all those records? Why had Mark been so determined to make me feel responsible? And who had been sending me those documents? I almost called someone that night. Almost. But I didn't know who to call. I didn't have enough information to explain what was happening without sounding completely paranoid. So I did what I'd been doing for the past few weeks. I documented everything. I put the envelope in a folder. I saved the emails. I saved the system records. I wrote down every conversation I could remember. Then I went to bed. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was still mostly empty. I walked toward my desk. And stopped. There were 2 men standing near reception. Dark suits. One of them was holding a badge. I knew, immediately. My stomach dropped. The receptionist looked terrified. One of the men said something quietly to her. Then both men turned. And looked directly at me. For a second, nobody moved. Then one of them walked toward me. "Daniel?" "Yes." He showed me his credentials. Federal Bureau of Investigation. I felt all the air leave my lungs. He lowered the badge. "We need to speak with you." I looked toward Mark's office. His blinds were open. He was standing behind the glass. And he was staring at the agents. I looked back at the FBI agent. Am I in trouble? No. That answer somehow made me even more nervous. "Then why are you here?" He glanced toward the hallway. "Because we believe someone has been using your credentials to conceal financial activity inside this company." I couldn't speak. The agent continued. "We need your cooperation." I swallowed. "Okay." He nodded. "There's something you need to understand, Daniel." "What?" "You're not the target." I thought about the envelope on my desk. The words suddenly made sense. I looked toward Mark again. He had gone completely still. The second agent was already walking toward his office. Mark stepped away from the glass. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. The FBI agent beside me noticed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Everything suddenly clicked. The sick day. The meetings. The altered files. The warnings. The strange records. The anonymous documents. Someone had been building a case. But they hadn't been building it against me. They had been building it around me. And apparently, I'd been standing directly in the middle of it, without even knowing. The agent asked me to come into a conference room. I followed him. Once the door closed, he sat across from me. "We've been investigating irregular financial activity connected to this company." I listened. For several months, funds were being moved through accounts associated with company clients. The activity was structured to look like legitimate internal transfers. My mouth went dry. "How does my account fit into that?" "Your credentials were used to authorize or access some of the records." "I didn't authorize anything." "We know." I stared at him. "How?" He placed a folder on the table. "We reviewed the access history." He opened it. "The activity associated with your credentials occurred at times that didn't match your physical presence in the office." I nodded slowly. "The weekends?" "Yes." "The nights?" "Yes." "The day I was out of town?" He nodded. "Exactly." I leaned back. "So, someone had my credentials?" "That's what the evidence indicates." "Who?" The agent didn't answer. "Not yet." He turned another page. There were multiple people with administrative access. I felt my stomach tighten. "Mark? We're not asking you to identify anyone." "Then why are you telling me?" "Because there's something else." He slid another document toward me. It showed an approval chain. My name appeared first, then another account. Then, a management approval. I stared at it. What am I looking at? That's the important part. He pointed to the dates. The transactions were being initiated under credentials that appeared to belong to you, but the final approvals required elevated access. I looked at the second username. Who has that? The agent looked at me. Your boss. I didn't say anything. For a moment, I just stared at the page. Mark, the man who had spent weeks telling me I was becoming difficult. The man who had accused me of accessing files I had every reason to access. The man who had told me to stop digging. The man who had told me to think carefully about what I wanted to happen next. The man who had spent 4 years convincing me that loyalty meant obedience. I suddenly understood why he'd been so calm. He hadn't been trying to figure out what happened. He had been trying to control what I knew. The agent continued. There's more. He opened another folder. We found evidence that some records were altered after the original transactions. To make it look like I did them? Exactly. I felt sick. Why me? Because you had legitimate access. So my account would look believable. Yes. I stared down at the table. All those late nights, all those weekends, all those times I'd logged in from home. I'd spent years making myself the perfect person to impersonate. My credentials were trusted. My work habits were predictable. And because I had always been the guy who stayed late, it was easy to make the records look like something I had done. The agent looked at me. You also became important because you noticed discrepancies. I remembered the first file. The one that had made me uncomfortable. The one I'd closed. The one I'd reopened. You knew I found them? We believe they knew. I looked toward the conference room door. What happens now? We need you to keep cooperating. I will. And Daniel? Yeah? Don't delete anything. I almost smiled. I haven't. I know. That sentence gave me chills. They already knew. They'd been watching the records. They'd been following the trail. And apparently, I had unknowingly been helping them. The door opened. Another agent stepped inside. He looked at the first agent. He's ready. The first agent nodded. I knew immediately who they meant. Mark. I stood. Can I stay? The agent looked at me. You don't need to. I want to. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. We walked down the hallway. People were staring. Nobody was pretending to work anymore. Mark's office door was open. 2 agents stood inside. Mark was sitting behind his desk. His hands were folded. He looked nothing like the man I'd known for 4 years. No confidence. No controlled expression. No quiet intimidation. Just a tired man staring at the table. One of the agents placed a folder in front of him. We need to ask you about several transactions. Mark looked up. I don't know what you're talking about. The agent opened the folder. We have records. I'd like my attorney. You're free to contact one. Mark looked toward the door. Then, he saw me. His face changed. Just slightly. Daniel. I didn't answer. He looked at the agents. Then back at me. You told them? I felt something inside me snap. I didn't tell them anything. He stared at me. And for once, I didn't look away. The agent beside me said, Mr. Anderson, we'd like you to answer a few questions. Mark shook his head. I have no idea what this is about. The agent placed another document on the desk. Then you should have no trouble explaining this. Mark looked down. His face went pale. It was an authorization record. His credentials. His approval. His timestamp. The same transaction chain we'd been discussing. He stared at it. Then he looked up. That's not. He stopped. The agent waited. Mark tried again. That's not what it looks like. One of the agents nodded. That's what we're here to determine. Mark looked at me. I could see anger returning to his face. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself involved in. I almost laughed. Because that was exactly what I'd been thinking for weeks. But now, I understood something. I hadn't gotten myself involved. I'd been dragged into it. By people who thought they could use my name without consequences. The investigation continued for several hours. I answered questions. I provided copies of emails. I showed the agents my notes. I explained my schedule. I told them about the night I'd found the altered file. I told them about Mark's warning. I told them about the envelope. They wanted to know where I'd found it. I didn't know. I told them exactly that. Eventually, they showed me enough evidence to make the whole picture clear. The financial activity had been going on for months. Money had been moved through legitimate company channels and then redirected through accounts controlled outside the normal process. The records were altered afterward. My credentials were used to make the activity appear legitimate. But the approval trail led back to Mark, and Mark had made one critical mistake. He had assumed that because I was loyal, I wouldn't question anything. He was wrong. The more he pressured me, the more carefully I started documenting. The more he tried to intimidate me, the more evidence he created. And every time he told me to stop asking questions, he gave investigators another piece of the story. Eventually the company suspended Mark. Then came the formal investigation. Then the legal proceedings. I wasn't involved in the decisions. I wasn't the one who exposed everything. The evidence did that. But I had helped preserve it. And that mattered. A few weeks later, I was officially cleared. No disciplinary action. No criminal charges. No permanent mark on my record. My name was removed from the internal investigation as a subject. I remember sitting in a small conference room when they told me, "You are not under investigation." I nodded. I'd already heard it from the FBI. But hearing it officially still felt different. I walked out of that room and sat in my car. For several minutes, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there. 4 years. I thought about 4 years. All that time I'd spent trying to prove I was loyal. Trying to be dependable. Trying to make Mark proud. I had missed dinners. Missed weekends. Canceled my honeymoon. Worked through holidays. Stayed awake answering emails. And when I finally needed one sick day, the man I'd sacrificed everything for had looked at me like I was an inconvenience. I thought about the message. If you're healthy enough to text, you're healthy enough to work. For weeks, that sentence had made me angry. Now it made me sad. Because it showed me exactly what my loyalty had been worth to him. Nothing. The company eventually offered me a different position. A senior operations role with better pay and clearer boundaries. I turned it down, not because I hated the work. I actually still liked the work. I just didn't want to spend another 4 years proving my worth to people who measured loyalty by how much of your life you were willing to give away. I found another job. A smaller company, better management, reasonable hours. And the first time my new boss told me, "Take the day if you're sick. We'll figure it out." I almost didn't know how to respond. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because I wasn't used to hearing it. "Are you sure?" He looked at me. Of course. That was it. No guilt. No lecture. No demand for proof. Just basic human decency. And that's when I realized something I'd missed for years. A job is supposed to be part of your life. It isn't supposed to become your entire life. Mark had taught me to measure my value by how much I could sacrifice. The experience taught me the opposite. Your worth isn't determined by how many weekends you give away. It isn't measured by how many late-night emails you answer. And it definitely isn't measured by whether you show up to work with a 103-degree fever. I still think about that morning sometimes. The thermometer, the shaking hands, the message, the moment I realized something was terribly wrong. And then I think about 3 weeks later, when those FBI agents walked into the office and asked for me. Everyone thought I was in trouble. For a few terrifying seconds, I thought so too. But they weren't there to arrest me. They were there because someone had used my name to hide what they had done. And eventually, that same trail led straight back to the person who thought he was untouchable. Mark had spent 4 years making people afraid of him. He thought fear meant control. He thought loyalty meant silence. He thought because I had always said yes, I'd never say no. But the irony was that the one time I finally said no, one simple sick day, was the moment everything started falling apart for him. I never got revenge on Mark. Not really. I didn't need to. I didn't expose him. I didn't destroy his career. I didn't set a trap. I didn't even report him myself. He did most of the damage on his own. Every altered record, every false trail, every threat, Every email. Every attempt to make me look responsible. He had spent years believing that if he controlled the people around him, he controlled the outcome. He forgot one thing. Records don't get intimidated. Emails don't get scared. Timestamps don't care who your boss is. And evidence doesn't care how important you think you are. A few months after everything ended, I was cleaning out an old box at home when I found something that made me stop. My old work badge. I held it in my hand for a long time. 4 years of my life were attached to that little piece of plastic. I thought about the person I'd been when I first walked into that building. I wanted to tell him something. I wanted to tell him that being dependable was a good thing. But being dependable didn't mean being available every second. Working hard was good. Destroying yourself to prove you were worth keeping wasn't. And loyalty was valuable. But it had to go both ways. I put the badge back in the box. Then I closed the lid. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I just felt finished. Because the truth was, my boss didn't lose everything because I took one sick day. He lost it because he spent years believing everyone around him was too afraid to question him. He was wrong. And that one message he sent me on the morning I had a 103-degree fever became the line I remember most clearly. Not because it was the cruelest thing he ever said, but because it was the moment I finally stopped believing that my job owed me a future just because I'd given it 4 years of my past. I had spent 4 years thinking loyalty meant never saying no. It took 1 fever, 1 text, and 3 terrifying weeks to teach me what loyalty actually means. Sometimes loyalty is knowing when to stay. Sometimes it's knowing when to walk away. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do for yourself is finally realize that you were never supposed to prove your worth by sacrificing your entire life for a paycheck. I wish I'd learned that 4 years earlier. But honestly, I'm just grateful I learned it at all.